Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 16th of December 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Garish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. The weather is cold, wet and dingy. We're not going to talk about it anymore. So let's get straight on to the Constitution. And of course, we're witnessing in these present days and weeks, literally the ripping apart of Britain's Constitution.
Indeed, so here we are. This is actually not the Bill of Rights, it's the Declaration of Rights, which was the precursor document. So this is one of our key constitutional documents, later ratified by the next Parliament as the Bill of Rights. Well, who says we need a Bill of Rights? Because British Bill of Rights, some people seem to say we need one, but in fact we've already got one. This is it. This is a Declaration of Rights, as I say, February 1688. The Bill of Rights signed today in 1689, Declaration of Right was imposed on William and Mary as a condition of them assuming the crown. And in other words, they would only be elected, because in theory at least, we still elect our kings and queens, by the people if they accepted its terms. So the Declaration of Right and the Bill of Rights clearly state that, for example, no foreign prince, person, prelate, state or potentate hath or ought to have any jurisdiction, power, superiority, preeminence or authority, ecclesiastical or spiritual, within this realm. So it can be clearly seen that every EU treaty imposed on us by Parliament is unconstitutional. Here's evidence that our monarch has broken her coronation oath, because by giving royal assent to EU treaties, she has broken her oath. And of course, other constitutional rights given by these contracts, the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, is the right to bear arms, in our self-defence, the right to petition the sovereign, the fact that we can't be imprisoned without cause, that the government can't arrest us if we disagree with government policies, habeas corpus, which can't be denied, no person compelled to make loans to the king, and there will be no tax without the approval of Parliament. So in other words, no taxation without representation, as they say. And soldiers and sailors will not be billeted on civilians. And of course, government will not impose martial law during peacetime, or in fact have any standing arming during peacetime. We're going to come on to that in a second. So it's perhaps ironic or treasonous maybe that today the House of Commons Constitution Committee hears evidence from business organisations and local government on the union and devolution. Well, who's going to be on the panel that are being queried by the Constitution Committee? We've got Stephen Herring, Head of Taxation at the Institute of Directors, Martin McTighe, National Vice Policy Chairman, Federation of Small Business, Sir Richard Leese of the Core Cities Organisation, and Lord Porter of Spalding, who's Chairman of the Local Government Association. Well, what kind of questions might they be asked? They might be asked, well, they might have been asked by now, because it started at 10:30 this morning. What are the most important elements, of the union from a business perspective? How and to what extent do differences in government policy between the nations of the UK affect business, and so on? So it's really all about devolution and splitting up the union, not maintaining it. Now, of course, I mentioned Sir Richard Leese, who from Core Cities. He's one of the so-called panellists. For more on Core Cities, do have a look at this article on the UK Column website, Rotten to the Core. Brilliant as always by Martin Edwards, but that'll give you an idea of what the Core Cities initiative is all about. And to add insult to injury, a new Armed Forces Bill is at the committee stage today. The need to have an Armed Forces Bill comes directly from the Bill of Rights, which, as I say, came into force this day in 1689. That requires consent of Parliament to be given to maintain an army in a time of peace. Well, are we in a time of peace? At least notionally, so they still go through the motions of this Armed Forces Bill. And of course, did someone say that we need a British Bill of Rights because we don't have one? Whoever that was, clearly an idiot. But anyway, the Bill of Rights this bill being taken to committee today. Nothing too much of note in it. It really amends one of the previous bills, except for clause 14. So let's have a look at that. This is from the Library of the House of Commons Library document there. Clause 14 does not amend existing legislation, but makes freestanding provisions. It extends to the Ministry of Defence firefighters statutory powers to act in an emergency, to protect life or property in line with those available to civilian fire and rescue authorities. Firefighters will have the power to do anything they reasonably believe to be necessary to protect life or property, or for the purpose of extinguishing or preventing a fire, to enter a premise or place by force if necessary, and to close roads and regulate traffic. So that all sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? You might expect that that would be the case, except for this, because back in June, the Financial Times reporting that Ministry of Defence is seeking bidders for military fire and rescue services. So in other words, this is going to be privatised. And who's going to end up with this contract? Well, the FT reports companies such as Serco, Babcock and Capita have been invited to submit proposals to run the Defence Fire Risk Management Organisation, which employs 2,200 staff at 78 defence fire stations worldwide. So what we're talking about here then is putting into law, apparently under this new army bill, the right of Serco to break down your door whenever they see fit. Obviously, it's couched in the language of emergency and fires and so on, but that can't be right, Brian.
Well, it's absolutely right, Mike. It's what they're doing. It's massive privatisation. I'm going to mention this a little bit later in the news. But of course, all of this going on, and I'm going to say once again, where are British senior military officers? What we're being told is that they are running absolutely scared. They've never come across this before. They're not being consulted. They know the military is being stripped away from under them, but they do nothing. So just a little plea from me with a smile on my face. If you have a member of your family, particularly if they're a retired senior officer, maybe you would just give us a bit of help and give them a bit of help by explaining to them what's actually happening in the country. So the military being cut, draconian cuts, this is to force the military into the European army system. That's happening very quickly. And of course, privatisation to get even control of the armed forces away from the public, protection of the public, and into the hands of corporate backers. This is very devious policy, Mike. It's subversion. It is treason.
It is treason. It is. Yeah.
Well, perhaps Prince Charles is going to step forward to say something about this or not. Now, this Mail article we think is very much deeper than you may think on initially reading through. But what's it all about? Well, it's about the subject of Prince Charles being sent highly classified cabinet documents for decades. And the Mail is crowing in the first instance because all of this has been exposed. They print a little excerpt of this cabinet memoranda. In fact, this was dated 1992. And what it says is that the standard circulation for cabinet memoranda includes the Queen, Prince of Wales, all members of the cabinet, any other ministers in charge of departments or to be treated as in charge of departments, etc., etc. So on one hand, they are saying it's absolutely wrong that Prince Charles should be able to see all these classified documents. He says, well, actually, we've been seeing these documents since the 1930s. But if you get deeper into this article, it is extremely interesting because it starts to effectively talk about the government's increasing secrecy over documents. And of course, that brings us on to the latest government attack on transparency. And that is to say, well, we don't really want the Freedom of Information Act to be working in the same way because it's getting too embarrassing. We can't run government. So remember, of course, that it was Tony Blair who admitted that one of the things he regretted was the Freedom of Information Act. Why? Because the public are astute enough to use this act to get the truth out as to what's going on. I'll just add that Prince Charles has declared that we should allow him to see all these documents because he's an advocate for the general public. So I've tweeted out this morning that he certainly is an advocate for me. And I still question what this man actually does for Britain as opposed for his private interests. But let's have a look at this. So there was the article. It says the government has set up an independent commission to look at ways of diluting the Freedom of Information Act. potentially by making it easier to refuse a request. So Tom Watson from Labour has said, well, this is disgraceful. It's taken Republic, a long time to delve into this, and if we lose transparency, we're going to be in trouble. And they also named Sir Jeremy Hayward, shown in the picture here, boss of the civil service, because, of course, this was the man who was desperate to get the covering up over the Chilcot inquiry. And surprise, surprise, the same man has said, oh, yes, we've definitely got to close down the Freedom of Information Act. So this article's got a lot going. One hand, you could say it's an attack on the monarchy. And of course, one of the things that we are pointing out is that it's the people within the monarchy that are a problem at the moment, not the actual monarchy.
Institution.
The institution itself. But what is going on here, of course, is the government hell-bent on another massive cover-up to deny information to the public. How would the government do this, Mike? Well, what you need is an independent commission. So let's bring in the independent commission. What can we tell you about this? Well, it's independent. The Independent Commission on Freedom of Information was established on the 17th of July 2015 to review the Freedom of Information Act 2000. What sort of people would you put on an independent commission? Well, you'd probably need some of these people. We're going to show them in their true glory. But we got interested as to how these people might have been chosen as independent people on the commission. We rang 6 media numbers for the Cabinet Office this morning, and surprise, surprise, none of those staff were at their desk answering the telephone.
Because the Cabinet Office drives the transparency agenda in Parliament.
Well, it's so transparent. I think they've got about 10 or 12 media members of staff, but those people so busy this morning, none of them could actually answer their telephone. So we'll give them a little ring this afternoon because we've a couple of questions, as you'll see. Let's have a look at those people. Well, here they are. The first one is the chairman of the Independent Commission, Lord Burns. He also works with Santander UK PLC. So good to see one of the bankers write in on whether we should be closing down and making government more secret. We've got this man, Lord Carlisle of Berriew. Rather a grey man. Doesn't instantly say a lot about this man on the government websites. But we've got a stalwart here, Lord Howard. Of course, this is the ex-Tory, or the Tory who was then connected to a rather dubious international security firm. He's just the sort of man to have a look at transparency. Or Dame Patricia Hodgson, just happens to be chairman of Ofcom and was a long-standing member of the BBC Trust. So these are all looking good, aren't they?
It's all looking very independent at the moment.
It's looking very independent. Well, let's bring in Mr. Independence, because here he is, Right Honourable Jack Straw. Remember that this was the man who thought that there should be a special law so that children in care who were being abused could not speak to the media and the press. Why would you do that, Mike?
Can't imagine.
Well, I think I can imagine. It's to stop children who are being abused by people in positions of power speaking out and spilling the beans.
On your brother?
Possibly.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at this, because we got a bit of a clue as to the scam of this commission in the Right Honourable Jack Straw's biography, because it says he was appointed in July 2015 as a member of the Independent Commission. So my question here, Mike, is who appointed the independent commissioners?
Was he not Home Secretary at the time that the Freedom of Information Act was brought in the first place?
I think he could have been.
So he's really independent then?
Well, I don't think so, but possibly you might think he's independent. This is the sort of language that is really the difference between good terrorists and bad terrorists.
Absolutely.
And perhaps these people are terrorists, but in a different disguise. Well, let's have a look at a bit more of this, because we've got the Telegraph, a really excellent article here. And what it's warning about is that, of course, aside from a close down of freedom of information, we've also got Leveson still beavering away in the background, trying to shut down press and the media. But the journalist here, Mike Harris, really tremendous article. He says, imagine the uproar if Vladimir Putin cooked up a new draconian press law in a backroom deal with lobbyists, with the public kept in the dark. Imagine if this new law was pushed through the Russian parliament in just 13 hours and 5 minutes, with politicians complaining they hadn't even seen what they were supposed to be debating. Now imagine the international reaction if this legislation forced newspapers to join Putin's state-imposed press regulator, because if they refused to join on principle, newspapers would pay the full legal costs of any shadowy oligarch or corrupt state official who sued them. This man is absolutely on the button. And we'll add this bit. Well, he says, of course, this didn't happen in Putin's Russia. It happened in Britain. So when people criticise the press and say the press is controlled, of course it is highly controlled, but it's not totally controlled. And where we see journalists doing their research and getting the truth out, we think it's up to us to praise and support these people. What have we got going on here? This is David Cameron and his Tory government working for a complete shutdown of free information, press and media, and of course the obtaining of public documents via freedom of information.
I hear tell that Lord Leveson's crying a little bit, or he's weeping about some of the pressure he's under.
Well, not Lord Leveson, Mike. Apparently his family, his sister in particular, has been very weepy because she says that nasty people in the press have been criticising him to such an extent that it's made her and other members of the family cry. So probably we feel quite sad about that. And Lord Leveson, if you'd like some positive publicity, please get in contact with the UK column, and I'm sure we'll be happy to have a very interesting and polite dialogue with you. There we are, public invitation to Lord Leveson. Well, let's keep digging, because without a free press and media, of course, the dictatorship comes very quickly. So let's remember this gentleman here, Chair of Trustees from Common Purpose, Bishop Tim Stevens. And on his website, the Common Purpose website, he says the link effectively between Common Purpose and Leveson was entirely misguided, because Common Purpose had no involvement whatsoever in the debate or in any campaigns for greater regulation of the press. No involvement there, Mike, according to a bishop, and surely he's telling the truth. The confusion arose because Sir David Bell, my predecessor as chairman of Common Purpose, and Julia Middleton, the chief executive of the Common Purpose Charitable Trust, were both part of setting up an independent, there's the word, an independent charity called the Media Standards Trust in 2006 to foster high standards in news media in the UK. So let's look at that little misunderstanding, that little bit of confusion. Here it is. We've got all the links as to the work done by Sir David Bell and Julia Middleton to set up an organisation to control the press, and they even set up the hacking inquiry and hacked off campaign in order to help get Mr. Leveson into power. Note bottom left-hand corner, aside from questions over who provided the funding for this pernicious little political charity, Demos, because of course Julia Middleton was highly involved with Demos, and we'll be having a look at that in a minute. So man of the cloth doesn't appear to be telling the truth. Not unusual, of course, is it now, for so-called men following Christ. Okay, well, we thought you'd like to have a little in-depth look at the Cabinet Office and what the Cabinet Office really is. Remember that UK column has been saying that, of course, it's Mr. Letwin that is now controlling the Cabinet Office in the country. But let's take you through how we see things. So who should we bring in? Well, we better mention Jeremy Haywood, Cabinet Secretary, Head of the Home Civil Service. And this is the man, of course, who was closing down Chilcot and is now beavering away to make sure freedom of information is stopped. We better bring in the corporate interest because here he is, John Manzoni. He's the chief executive, note the corporate language of the civil service. You can trust him because he spent 24 excellent years with BP and has also been involved with a Canadian energy company called Talisman. So there's the corporate interests. Let's bring in Francis Maude, Mike's favourite Minister for Transparency. And of course, it was UK Column that exposed the closed-door deals going on with Julia Middleton's Common Purpose organisation to train the top 200 civil servants.
Of course, he's not Francis Maude MP anymore because he's now the Right Honourable Lord Maude.
Lord Maude.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there we go. So dirty deals going on in the background. And let's come back to Demos because thank you very much to the lady who pointed out to us that in 1968, strangely, Demos was predicting the privatisation of the NHS. We've seen this particular pamphlet book, and if you go through it, you can see that step by step, everything taking us towards the privatisation of the NHS. This is the plan, Mike, straight out of Demos, and of course Julia Middleton intimately connected with that. Well, let's come down here because the man himself, Oliver Letwin, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, of course, and that means that he's also Keeper of the Queen's billions and an NN Rothschild man.
Well, he would be.
He would be, wouldn't he? Well, we also discovered that he'd written a book. What was that book? Well, it was called Privatising the World.
Good.
Have a look at this book. It's just incredible. Prefaced there by John Redwood MP. This is the instructions for privatising the world. And this is the man who is currently running not only the Cabinet Office, but controlling Conservative policy and, of course, controlling David Cameron. Well, excuse me, we can't forget Matthew Gould, former ambassador, British ambassador to Israel. He's now the Minister for Cyber Security. And of course, it was Matthew Gould that brought in this huge interlinked collaboration between GCHQ, British intelligence, and Israeli security firms, including universities. And if you don't like that, well, it's an amazing coincidence that he's also brought in Israeli companies to help out the NHS and bring cost-saving measures by using Israeli expertise. So those are some of the people, of course. Sorry, that's that article, just so you can see I'm reporting correctly. Here's the Jewish Chronicle article on that. And we'll just remind ourselves that the Cabinet Office is also the sponsor for that independent Freedom of Information Commission. I think these men are trustworthy, Mike.
Gotta be.
Got to be. To the people paying them, of course. Well, let's come on to some good news.
Yeah, another reminder of the competition ends 1st January 2016. Get us your short audio recordings, any subject you want, no more than 15 minutes, please. And you can email them to editor@ukcolumn.org, or if you're able to contact me through Facebook, you can do it that way. If the file itself, it shouldn't be too big to send by email, but if you feel it is, then you can use services like WeTransfer or other similar services to send it to us. But send it to editor@ukcolumn.org by the 1st of January, and we'll announce the winner as soon as possible after we come back on the 4th of January.
Indeed.
Do get involved. So what's next? Finance.
Has to be.
Right, well,
The
Tories,
driver, isn't it, really?
Yes, indeed. And we just see the continuing melting away of any kind of backlash for the financial system from the 2007-2008 crash. So the Tories have quietly scrapped a crackdown on fat cat bank bosses, according to the Mirror. And what they're saying is that Labour and Lib Dem peers have voiced their fury over the move was slipped without fanfare into an obscure section of a new banking law. So Baroness Kramer, as Lib Dem, called it outrageous, and she accused George Osborne of buckling to pressure from his friends from the banks, and warned it would not allow bosses to turn a blind eye to another LIBOR rate rigging scandal. So, of course, we've got to see this in the overall context, because Mark Carnage has said that we have to stop hating bankers now. We've got It's time to stop bashing bankers was the actual thing he said. And of course, that's why the Bank of England held its open forum event a couple of months ago. That's why he's working so hard to relax the ring fence, which was notionally imposed after the crash in 2007, but which doesn't have to be implemented until 2019. The Bank of England says they're working towards implementation by 2019, but of course, every day that passes, it is watered down more and more. What we need, just as a reminder, is complete separation of the banks, a full Glass-Steagall type legislation, and we need to get rid of George Osborne yesterday.
And we need to bring in the Bradbury.
Indeed.
A lot more on the Bradbury coming in 2016. Well, it's only appropriate, really, Mike, that the bankers are above the law, aren't they? They're clearly different people, so I think fair enough. Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't quite know how to put that, but let's use this as an example, because a lot of people sent us this article or references to it. There was an appeal recently when a gentleman who'd been convicted of homophobic crime through preaching in the street. He's won his appeal, which is quite a landmark judgment. But we just wanted to comment a little bit on this case, because this is the judge, Qureshi. Qureshi's a Muslim, and in the original trial, when he found Mr. Overd guilty, he also told him which parts of the Bible he could use and could not use. So we had a judge clearly sitting in his own court, actually saying, well, it doesn't matter what the subject brought in front of me, I know you must do as I say. Now, we would like to get people to look through what is clearly inflammatory religious angle, which some of the papers have picked up on. We are particularly interested in the fact that judges are now becoming a complete law unto themselves. So we know that they're running courts which are not courts, they're places of businesses. We know that when we ask the Judicial Appointments Commission who appointed them, nobody wants to answer the emails. So we're now getting to the situation, or we're now seeing the situation, where these judges are simply making up the law to please themselves. The important research that needs to be done is who is appointing them and on what basis. And as a certain gentleman would say, what is the source of the spring from whence they get their power? So at the moment, until we can get common law justice back into our courts, of course, any judge with their own bias, whether that is for a particular religion or perhaps it's to do with business connections. Obviously, we're seeing in Scotland that the business interests of judges not important. We need to get this out into the open. We could do with some help on research. We'd also encourage you to do some research on the subject of what's happening with religion. This is a phenomenal book. It's called False Dawn. It's by a gentleman called Lee Penn. It's extremely thick. It's got a vast number of footnotes showing all the sources. And what is this book describing? It is describing the manipulation of all world religions in order to create the United Religions Initiative. And this, of course, is the single world religion, which, if you gently peel the top off the label, is remarkably close to Luciferianism. So for those people getting very emotive about it's a particular religion we should be frightened of, can I encourage you to do some research? And also, we are still asking for help in establishing who the people were who approved Satanism for use on board Royal Navy warships. Who were those people, men or women? We think the British public has a right to know their names.
Okay, no, you're a bit premature there.
Apologies.
Right, so last week we mentioned the fact that Saudi was holding a big meeting to try and create a 35-state Islamic coalition against terrorism, apparently. Now, there's a laugh. So, because Saudi Arabia being one of the worst terrorist states on the planet. But anyway, that did take place yesterday, and of course the military headquarters of this new coalition is going to be Riyadh. It's going to be run by Deputy Crown Prince and Minister of Defence Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and he said that this coalition will target all terrorist organisations in the Islamic world. So they're going to start with themselves, I wonder. So the new organisation, of course, is not going to include Iran or Iraq. Of course not. It's clearly not going to include Syria. Iraq, of course, is going to be occupied, as we reported yesterday, by, well, at least that's the report anyway, by 100,000 troops from this coalition plus the United States. And I believe that Iraq and Syria are slated to cease to exist as a result of all this. Now, of course, the Brookings Institute, not a terribly nice organisation, they say the Arab world has been talking about military alliances since the 1940s, but has yet to produce a serious arrangement. This latest move may be a step in that direction. Well, we wait to see, but bearing in mind that all that Saudi has done over the last number of decades is incite terrorism, we'll see whether this actually turns into something different. I think not.
Well, we'll also say, of course, they're in the background, presumably helping to fund the latest commission saying that Britain is no longer a Christian country. Let's not forget that Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, refusing to answer the questions at the moment as to who funded the commission put forward in the first place by the Wolf Institute, but with Saudi and Qatar both in the background. So another open question, public question to the Archbishop of Canterbury: when can we have details of the funding streams for that attack on Christianity in UK?
Okay, well, another person under attack is another MP, apparently. So here we have Labour MP Anna Turley this time. She has apparently cancelled her surgery this week because she's received threatening messages over social media. Naturally, the exact circumstances of the threat aren't being revealed. And she said, apparently, according to this article, that it's related to an ongoing local issue, although those concerned are not constituents. And of course, this follows on from the earlier threats apparently made to, well, this is Lucy Allangate, isn't it? Because was she threatened? Was she not threatened? Clearly she wasn't. Clearly she was telling fibs. So she is now getting everything off the internet as quickly as possible, as Guido Fawkes is talking about here. So I'm going to call this whole lot a false flag. It's an attack on social media, actually, not an attack on MPs. And it's an attack on freedom of access to our so-called elected representatives. And, well, let's say there was a grain of truth to these stories, then I would have thought that rather than getting all indignant about it, as they seem to be, perhaps they might consider what it is that would bring someone to threaten them in this way in the first place. But I don't believe a word of it, let's put it that way.
No, we have been told, though, Mike, that some of the MPs getting jittery because they're beginning to understand the public doesn't like what they're doing. So this is a clue for the fact that people's opinion, when it's put forward in the right way, does count. MPs worried, unable to sleep. That sounds a terrible thing to me.
I wonder whether Oliver Colville whether the hedgehogs will still be able to visit him.
Possibly. Well, why do we need free press and media? To get truth out, or at least to start looking at evidence to see whether it's truthful or not. And a remarkable article here in the Belfast Telegraph talking about a Turkish MP, Mr. Erdem, who has made some very, very interesting statements. He's been talking about the use of sarin gas in Syria. And he says, remember the chemical attack in Ghouta. Remember, it was claimed that the regime forces were behind it. This attack was conducted just days before the sarin operation in Turkey. And he goes on, it's a high probability this attack was carried out with those basic materials shipped through Turkey. It is said the regime forces are responsible, but the indictment says it's ISIS. Now, what he's talking about is an indictment that was going on inside Turkey to do with the movement, he says, of sarin and chemicals capable of making it. And this man is saying categorically that the use of these chemicals was not by Assad's forces, it was actually by ISIS and terrorists within Syria. So how remarkable that it's taken the Belfast Telegraph to stand up and print this article. I may be wrong, Mike. Has anybody seen this in the BBC at all?
No.
Well, not that we know about. If anybody else has got information on it.
I wouldn't have thought the BBC would often cover stuff that's been on RT, of course.
Well, that's true, yeah. But Belfast Telegraph gets the prize here. Yeah. So let's remind ourselves, we've got Mr. Erdem there from Turkey, as featured in the Belfast Telegraph. It was the UK column alone that pointed out that Brooks Newmark, Conservative MP, consistently claimed that there was evidence that Assad had used chemical weapons. We said that evidence does not exist. There is no proof that Assad used those weapons, and we stand by that. Not a single document was proof that he used them. And we're just going to say to people, who would you rather believe? We've got a Turkish MP. The Turkish MP's effectively putting his life at risk by speaking out on this subject. I can imagine a lot of people would want this man dead. Or we could bring in David Cameron's expert, and this man, when he had his clothes on, was meeting with General Idris of the Free Syrian Army on the Turkish border, openly claiming that that organisation, the Free Syrian Army, was linked to terrorists. Who would you believe, Mike? We're having a problem today. Let's move on to this one. Now, this is another, we'll say, story, but it's quite interesting. It's clearly got bias in it, coming from the Russian insider, but nevertheless, the subject matter is interesting. They're saying that US pilots in Syria were ordered to ignore ISIS oil convoys. There's a little bit of Mickey taking here because they describe the American A-10 tank buster being used as a dinosaur. But the article claims that American pilots have been speaking out about the fact that they have not been allowed to tackle these ISIS oil convoys at many locations. So they've been talking in the States, they've been talking to senators, but nobody is picking up on what they're talking about. Presumably, if this is true, Mike, this situation will be made worse for those American pilots because they're now watching Russian pilots do the job for them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're just going to end on a UK column article, another UK column article that went up yesterday. If you haven't read this, the former Children's Commissioner, in her own words, if you're a parent or grandparent, you need to read this article, because this lady is giving more than a glimpse into what this government has got planned for our children. And in her own words, she is saying very clearly that you as a parent have no rights. We, the state, own your children. And I believe she's even saying to the age of 19.
Yeah, 19, which isn't too far away from the named person scheme in Scotland, of course.
Correct. So, a pretty dark news today. I pause there because it's sometimes difficult for us to know exactly how to get some of this material across. What do we need to do? We need to keep our eye on free press. We need to be encouraging journalists, whether they're mainstream or alternative or web-based. Anybody who's speaking out is speaking the truth, is exposing what's going on. They need our support. And it's up to all of us to be getting in the faces of those very scared politicians, demanding to know what they are doing about the situation, and also giving them information to allow them to act. We think there are cracks starting to appear both in the Conservative and the Labour administration. Action conquers fear on this one.
Just before we go, we'll mention that we hope to see as many people as possible at the UK column meeting tonight. It's going to be a bit more relaxed than usual, so we'll have some food and some, no doubt we'll be drinking some beer.
Indeed.
Yes.
Okay, so if you're local or can travel to come and see us and have a chat, we would love to see you. I nearly forgot. A couple of people have asked for a brief update on Melanie Shaw. I can tell you that Melanie is in accommodation now, which is of a reasonable standard. She's just trying to get her life back together. But of course, one of the problems ongoing is the fact that she's still finding it remarkably difficult to get access to her son, and that process being controlled, of course, by social services. We'll see what happens on that front. And also, Robert Greene still doing some excellent campaigning against child abuse, and we'll be giving an update on Robert Greene on Friday. So join us then if you would like the latest news.
Mark Anderson joins us tomorrow, so we'll see you then at 1 o'clock.
Okay, that's it. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.